Okay, so I'm going to call this pep talk. And I'm calling it pep talk because generally what I think of when I think of a pep talk is somebody telling a group of people that they have something to look forward to. There's something great coming, but that there's going to be a lot of work required to get there. So that's what this is going to be. The great thing coming that I'm talking about is that we're going to be in an era soon which is going to mirror sort of what the 1950s was after World War II and the Great Depression. So imagine coming out of that crisis and all of a sudden you have this period where people say, what are we going to do now? How are we going to define ourselves? What is our story? What is our vision of the future? What are we going to do? And how are we going to move forward as a society, really? And sites were set on building interstate highways and landing on the moon and building all these institutions that were updated versions of, and sometimes completely new institutions based off of what had previously existed before that terrible crisis that was the Great Depression and World War II. So we're about to go into one of those eras, and we're going to be forced to say, how are we going to define ourselves moving forward? What do we want to see? And how do we improve these institutions that are currently really falling apart and oftentimes entirely dysfunctional and dated? And the idea is to pick the best elements out of the rubble, right? Because I don't think there's going to be the degree of rubble that existed, literal rubble, after World War II. But I do think that there's going to be a lot of fragmented ideas, and people aren't going to exactly understand how to build a cohesive narrative out of that. So, what you need before you can decide how you're going to build these new institutions is a narrative that defines what you're moving toward. It's the same thing in a company or in pretty much any other ventures. Like, you have to have a vision, you have to have somebody with that vision who can lead, and then other people can contribute towards that vision. And when I say institutions, that word gets thrown around a lot, but what I mean is the media is an institution, our criminal justice system is an institution, our government is an institution, corporations are institutions, our religious organizations and churches, synagogues, mosques, etc. are institutions. All these things, and it's not even just brick and mortar. I'm not just talking buildings and the people that work within them, but I'm talking about the ideas that these institutions are built around. A lot of them are extremely dated. So there's this book that has been pretty instrumental to my thinking on this, and I know not everybody is into reading, is into books, and I get that. Maybe you could find a summary of this, I'm sure you can, on Wikipedia or a video about it. But the book is called The Fourth Turning. And the premise of the book is that basically every 80 to 100 years, society has a crisis. And going back a couple hundred years, the original crisis for the United States was the American Revolution. And then after that was the Civil War. And then after that was the Great Depression and World War II. And the book is called The Fourth Turning because we're in the fourth crisis. We're in the fourth phase of that, not fourth phase, but the fourth turning of the cycle. And we're going through a crisis right now. And I don't think it's going to be like a total war like it has been in the past. I actually think that the developments of the last 80 years have really changed what exactly we might be looking at, particularly the invention of thermonuclear weapons has really raised the stakes. So can you afford to get into a war when that's the cost? The other thing is um, the internet. Think about how the internet is both a pressure release valve and a pressure cooker at the same time. So things that previously would have escalated into violence might now not escalate into violence, and also vice versa, maybe. So I don't know quite how those things are going to interact. But the point is, we're going through a crisis right now, and generally, the way that these authors talk about these cyclical crises is uh, they last about 20 years. And they wrote this book back in 1994. They argued that we would start the crisis in the mid 2000s, so around like 2007, and that it would continue until like 2027. And sometimes these crises are just like a really anxious period in time where people are at each other's throats and everything is unclear, and there's just a general shittiness to the whole situation, basically. I think we can all relate to that over the last, particularly ramped up since the 2016 election, right? And so after you have these crises, which last 20 to 25 years, you then have another phase of the cycle, which is a high, which is generally like the previous high was post World War II. It went from the 1945 to like basically when Kennedy got assassinated in 1963. And so in these periods, you build up after the chaos of the crisis, because the crisis is the low point, and then you reach the high and you determine what are you going to be from now on. How are you going to take um, all of the built up um, realizations and the mismatch that has established itself over the last 80 years since the previous crisis? How are you going to then implement that into your system? Like, how are you going to take all of the new discoveries and build it into your system? In our case, look at all the new technologies that have come about, right? They don't mesh with the systems that we have in place because they were designed back in the World War II era. So we have this really awkward situation where we're kind of skating on existing systems and institutions, and they're not fit for the society. They're no longer fit for the society in which we live. Um, Generally, after you have a high, you have a 20 to 25-year awakening. You can think about that as, remember the countercultural and Vietnam era, where at some point people say, particularly younger people say, all right, this is a really kind of boring, culturally stagnant, and restrictive period in which we're living in. And I want something interesting to happen, and not everything is as great as it seems. And so things start to fray a bit, and then you have an unraveling, which is another 20 to 25-year period, which is basically from, I want to say like the early 80s to 2007, and that's when everybody becomes pretty hyper independent. So it's the opposite of the crisis mode, where people start sort of coming together. The high is when people are most together and moving towards a common goal. There's a sense of civic unity. So it's pretty fascinating. Those are the phases of the cycles, but there's another whole aspect of the book which describes how each generation that's born is actually very much shaped by the mood, by the zeitgeist of the era in which they're born. So, were you born in a crisis? Were you born in a high, in an awakening, in unraveling? And so there are these four archetypes that the authors use to describe the generations, depending on when they're born and how they're going to react to these different phases of the cycle based on which part of their life they're in. And so, um, not to sound arrogant here, I'm trying to just focus on uh, one that I consider. Well, actually, there's two in particular that are going to be important, but one of them happens to be the generation that I'm in, which is the millennial generation. And essentially, if you're born during an unraveling, that means that you come of age during a crisis. And so that means that you're in the second quarter of your life. You're 25 through 50. And so generally, if you're in that phase, if you were born during that period, during the crisis, you're going to be, well, the authors term this a hero generation. So the previous generation that came of age during a crisis and really, in a lot of ways, were the foot soldiers of the crisis was the greatest generation, our grandparents, right? They stormed Normandy and they stood up and did what was necessary to, quite frankly, get shit done and to make sure that the world wasn't plunged into chaos. And so the next hero generation supposedly is supposed to be the millennial generation that could also include some of Z and some of X on either side, but it's it's clustered in that age cohort. And that is really something that I have thought a lot about. And I think that what you're going to see is this emphasis on cleanup efforts of all of the things that have gone wrong and sort of rehabilitating the country and the sense of humanity after everybody has been at each other's throats and hating each other and after all the tension has built up over the last 20 years. So I think that you're going to see underestimated younger people with the grasp of technology and how they're going to effectively implement it into institutions really taking an active role in this next era, this next high. And that's exactly what happened after World War II is the returning GIs and the woman who had stayed at home during the war and who had entered industry and who had you know maintained the household and the families and everybody um, kind of got into the spirit of what can we do, what can we build, how can we make this country better, a sense of civic mindedness, I think civil society is the term, where it's you had huge involvement in clubs and organizations and this and that, and community life was pretty vibrant at that point in time. Now, granted, back in the 50s, this was a point in time that there were still many problems with I guess you could say equality. This was pre-civil rights movement, and that was actually part of this whole era. Is hey, let's focus on civil rights. Let's try to solve some of these things that have been continuous issues. And so the idea is this upcoming high is going to be a more inclusive high for other people to, for everybody to be able to engage in and add to. So that's the good thing is that we have something to look forward to and something that historically has been cyclically occurring. So it's not inevitable. That's what we need to realize is it very well will happen with our efforts, but we have to make sure that it happens in the way that in the best way possible, really. So here's the bad part is that maybe you've heard the expression, the night is darkest before the dawn. We're about to go through a very difficult election, and it's going to be a very bumpy ride. And what people are looking for right now is bold leadership and bold ideas. And this is where I talk about, take anything I say with a grain of salt. Obviously, I'm not an oracle. I'm not somebody that is all-knowing, and I'm very much fallible. I make mistakes. But this is how I view this upcoming election. Is first of all, it's young versus old, but not necessarily the candidates themselves. The viable candidates right now are all boomers, right? And when I use these generational distinctions, I don't mean them as a pejorative. I'm just simply, it's easier to sort of use them. I'm not trying to insult anybody or demean based on whatever era in which you were born. But the way that I see it is we have this growing rift, a generational divide that is possibly, probably larger than any generational divide that's ever existed before. Maybe you've heard the term the generation gap. This was a term that was first brought about just, let's see, in the Vietnam era, where you had the young people who were pissed off and didn't want to be sent to war to die, and they had different views of society and the world as compared to their more conservative parents in the world that their parents grew up in. So you had this big generation gap where the generations really did not understand each other. So now you have an echo generation gap, which is those people that lived through the original generation gap are now our parents, if you're part of the millennial slash Z generations, and they are they grew up pre-internet, and we grew up either 1 foot out of the internet era and 1 foot in the internet era, or entirely within the internet era. And the thing about the internet is that it's basically this fire hose of information where anything that you might believe, you will experience somebody that disagrees with you or something that contradicts what that belief is now if you're really exploring on the internet. So it's this opportunity to explore without other people watching you. So people behave very differently when they're in private versus when they're in public. Previously, I don't know, you'd have to go to the library or check out the microfiche or something like that if you even know what that is. So there wasn't really a lot of opportunity to explore ideas and not be, I don't know, put on a government list or something like that, right? If you explored radical ideas, you were probably wanted by the FBI. Um, but it's not just ideas about politics or fringe ideas, but it's views about sexuality and drugs and anything. So we've grown up seeing all this stuff, and our views are shaped by it because it was the most impressionable point in our lives. You know how they say that when you're basically 0 to, I don't know, 26, sometimes they move it up to like your mid 30s, your brain is really um, elastic and susceptible to information. It can really absorb and synthesize that information and build it into your narrative and how you view the world. So anybody that was born pre-internet didn't have the ability to do that in those formative years to engage with that amount of information. And the information that they had available to them was strictly the pre-digested narratives that were put together by the media and the government and corporations, right? So there is a lot of propaganda that exists, particularly from the Cold War era, and um, there's there's a lot of brainwashing that occurred basically. And to unlearn that brainwashing, particularly at a late stage in life, is extremely difficult. And I'm not blaming anybody for being brainwashed. It just happens to be the age in which, and it's not across the board. I'm not trying to refer to any group as if they're monolithic, but particularly among older people, this happens to be one of the reasons why there's an issue with um, most false information spread via Facebook, at least. I'm not sure about other social media, is spread by the boomer age cohort, is because they didn't grow up being able to distinguish between false accounts of, or I'm sorry, being able to distinguish between false information and information that's more vetted. So a lot of false information is spread. So that's kind of a generational skill set. And of course, plenty of millennials and Zs and X are also terrible at spreading information. But it generally, the trend is the older you are, the worse it is. So what we need to realize is right now our concept of the world and the way that it is kind of collapsing and giving way to something new. And there's a lot of kind of existential crisis that comes with that. Basically, the worldview that we all shared has shattered, and a lot of us are concerned, right, that once that's gone, that it's never coming back again. But this is actually kind of like a cyclical, just like the seasons of the year. How every year you have a winter and it's cold and it can be miserable, but um, you have the spring and the rebirth, kind of the phoenix effect after that. That's what we're in for next. And we're going to culminate around new ideas. It's just we need to make sure basically that we don't kill each other, in that we, if you're listening to this, if you consider yourself a thoughtful, responsible person, that you do your part to make sure that some of the more crazy, fringe people don't start uh, killing each other and causing too much chaos, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, looking back in history through the crises, it's not like all of society was engaged in the struggle at once. Even during World War II, which there was a lot of um, damage and loss of life, obviously, during World War II, but it's not like that was everywhere at once. It sort of happens in fits and bursts, and something might not be happening near you, or it might not be your family or your neighborhood or something like that, but it's happening someplace else. So it's important to keep in mind that our views of what societal chaos is are not necessarily what it actually will be. So keep this in mind, because we kind of forget that the powder kegs are stacked right now, and then all it takes is a spark, and it sets off violence and bad things, right? So we need as many people engaged and thoughtful and really constructively thinking about the next era and the next ideas that are going to make the country and the world more sustainable. And when I say sustainable, of course I mean environmentally sustainable, but I also mean economically sustainable. I mean just like it works for a greater number of people, because right now it's terrible in many ways, and the older generation, and you have to admit, like, understandably, we would be the same way if we were in this position, is they say, I don't want to shake up the system because it's the system I know, it's the system that I became successful through, and it's the system that protects my retirement account, right? So if we shake up the system too much, then uh, I don't have time to reinvent myself. And by the way, that's another thing that we're living through right now is, imagine you grow up at a time where demographics are relatively simple, and when job skills are relatively um, straightforward or more attainable, and then all of a sudden a new era comes about where all these foreign skills are in high demand, internet skills, technology skills, and the demographics are far more complex. So that's kind of what we're seeing right now, and there's that generation gap that enhances it. And then you also have the old view of, it's kind of a canard, but it's also, there's truth to it, is like, you know young people don't realize, they don't associate the word um, communism and socialism with negativity as much. I mean, I don't really think as many young people are trying to establish communism outright, but like, they don't really know how terrible the Soviet Union was, or how awful much of totalitarian the Chinese Communist Party can be. And let's not confuse the Communist Party with the Chinese people themselves. Let's not confuse any uh, population of people with their government, right? Because the U.S. government does some terrible stuff and has done some terrible stuff too, and it's important to keep that in mind. But my point is basically that you know a lot of younger people don't realize that people fled communism and came to the United States, and obviously part of that was the communist system itself that was being established, but part of it was what the U.S. was doing to go to war with communism. You can't really isolate the two and know exactly what was what. But the point is, a lot of people have really terrible memories of communism, and there is a, there was a lot of propaganda surrounding it in the United States, but there's also legitimate truths to, we want to avoid a totalitarian dictatorship with gulags like what you saw in the Soviet Union and what you're seeing in China to an extent, right? So I'm bringing this up because we need to be careful with how we talk about how we're changing the system. We want the system to work more for everybody in general, but we want to be mindful of not upending in creating some nightmare dystopian society. So how can we update the institutions and keep them liberal in their basis? And when I say liberal, I mean the traditional view of liberal. We need to parse liberal from progressive, because liberal came out of the Enlightenment, and it was the idea that people in general, you give them the ability to live as free of a life as possible, make their own mistakes, things like that, and allow them to basically pursue ideas and ventures and projects that they like. Free flow of ideas, free flow of information. Um, okay, so I bring this up because right now we are at a point where our total narrative has collapsed, and a lot of people have lost faith in the democratic process, and I completely understand why. We really need to be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what I mean by that is we need a strengthened democratic process, one that implements technology but doesn't swerve into the totalitarian and or authoritarian and oppressive. So, for example, we could potentially put the election process onto the technology that underlies cryptocurrency known as blockchain. That means that the election results would be visible to everybody, and we could have something called ranked choice voting, which is we vote on our first, second, and third choice, and that allows other candidates, not fringe candidates, that's a bad term to use, but I would say like third party candidates to join in the fray. So there are ideas that we can implement, and so there's this book called Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari. He's actually written 3 books. I've mentioned them a couple times in the podcast, and the book's basically, the first one is called Sapiens, and it's about human history, and it's about how, in a nutshell, stories and shared fictions have allowed people to cooperate at a large level, a societal level. In the past, it was if you got past about 150 people, which is called Dunbar's number, then the group would start to break down because trust would fray. People don't know the individual faces anymore, much beyond that. So, shared fictions like religious narratives, currencies, and national narratives all kept people together. That American flag up there, that is, a shared fiction that you all have this, the founding fathers and the flag and eagles and this and that, and that's what unites you. It's just, a bunch of stories mixed together, basically, with myth and some bits of truth. And the point is that fictions are powerful, and you have to choose your fictions carefully. And after religious narratives started to fall by the wayside, and you had Darwin come out with his On the Origin of Species and say, actually, we're not sort of God's top creature, we're one step in an evolutionary process. We need to realize that um, after those religious narratives started to fall by the wayside, the main narratives were they were called the humanist narratives, and they were um, socialist humanism, which is kind of the origin of communism, which is, hey, let's redistribute and make things even and fair for everyone. There was liberal humanism, which I sort of described before, which was, hey, let's basically allow people to live as freely as possible and let the chips fall where they may with minimum intervention. And then there was the third one, which was evolutionary humanism, which is, hey, let's shift resources and emphasis onto the elite people and kind of survival of the fittest type idea, which is close to what Nazism actually was. And so you had these three narratives battling it out over the 20th century, and then Nazism fell by the wayside with World War II after we saw the horrors of the concentration camps. And then after that, you had um, socialist humanism fall by the wayside when the Soviet Union collapsed. And then for the last 30 years, we've basically just been living with one grand narrative that has united people, which is the idea of free, fair elections and the democratic system, exporting it to as much of the world as possible, one global system and all that. Some people call it globalism, whatever. But that idea has started to see cracks recently when, you know, we saw that we have seen how the benefits of globalism are not distributed in a way that is sustainable, and you end up with uh, political movements that are more authoritarian in nature, that are generally very anti-immigrant, that are oftentimes highly populist in what they promise, and are generally pretty concerning. So we need to have an alternative that can be in place of what some of these authoritarian dictator type people are trying to promise, trying to implement. And so we're going through that crisis still right now. And this is what I think is going to happen in the United States in 2020 for the election, because this is going to be a crazy election year. Like I said, a young old divide, a bunch of other divides, unfortunately, are still carrying over, or the idea of divides. I think people think they're more divided than they actually are, which is unfortunate. There's an emphasis in a crisis more on what separates you rather than what you have in common. And that's what takes precedence in the high period is people start to realize, wait a second, we have far more in common than we have, uh, different from each other. Okay, so what I think is going to happen is there were really, as far as I could see, three candidates running in the United States that had actual stories, actual narratives that people craved so badly, because there's the status quo, which is, hey, let's keep things as they are. It really downplays how bad they are, and when it does, how bad things are, I should say, and when it does acknowledge that things are bad, it sort of says that, oh, the best way to deal with it is to just reassert things the way that they are, or the way that they have been. And a lot of people aren't buying that. What I see is that people right now, they want bold action. They want somebody who has a plan and a vision. And unfortunately, this is the time when people turn towards dictator types, and when people turn towards um, sometimes charlatans, and sometimes, what's the word I'm looking for? Demagogues. When somebody promises pie in the sky ideas and has no clear implementation of how they're going to actually get those things done, right? So right now, I see three people with visions, and one of them has since dropped out. But the first one is Donald Trump, and he tells a very simple story. And by the way, a lot of people like simple stories, and I'll get into intelligence and personality a bit after the fact, but I do think that there are a lot of people, and the research could demonstrate this, that I don't know, 60% of people, the majority of people, are authoritarian in nature, and they simply want to be told what to do, what to think. They don't want it to be too complex. They just want somebody who's going to make their life easy and straightforward, and kind of give them a sense of purpose. And then there are independent thinker types, and that's the whole liberal experiment kind of in a nutshell, is we need to get the independent thinker types to be um, as numerous as possible, or we need to support as many of them as possible. And that's where education, the idea of common, not common education, but public education originally surfaced from, is let's teach people to, um, to think critically. But I'll get into that later. So the point that I'm getting at is that 60% of people I think are authoritarian, and they just want a simple story, a simple narrative, and they don't want to think very hard. And so that's why you get politicians throughout history who just say a simple thing repeatedly over and over again. I mean, it's what happened with Adolf Hitler. It's what's happened with a bunch of uh, charismatic leaders that use propaganda, right? Is let's just make people feel good. Let's make simple promises, easy to understand ideas, and the rest is simple. Bread and circuses, that term before, is keep people fed, keep them entertained. Um, okay, so Donald Trump, he has a simple story. It is immigrants are the main villain, the media also, but immigrants, they add a face to people's problems. And the idea is if we get rid of this group or do something about it, then things can go back to the way that they were. It's a very nostalgic vision. It appeals primarily to older people because it's, hey, simply we can do this thing and return to an earlier, simpler time period. It's um, it's kind of the idea that like I said, it plays on nostalgia, and a lot of people don't realize that you can't return to that same point in time that you're envisioning with, make America great again. So I don't know what a lot of people have in their mind when they think of returning to that point, but generally it means simpler demographics, simpler economic skills, kind of like a time where we have more manufacturing jobs. And unfortunately, what the vision leaves out is that those aren't the same jobs that are going to be needed moving forward. Um, so it's almost like trying to go back to Disney World as an adult, where you don't realize that it's not just the external reality that made that world. It was your brain at the time. Like when you were a kid going to Disney World, everything was amazing and incredible because it was the first time you'd seen anything like it, and you saw how enormous everything was. And now, as an adult, if you go back, you see that things are actually much smaller. You see how things work. You see that the cartoon characters are actually people in costumes, all that kind of stuff. So like the magic is sort of gone. It's the same thing where if you return to your childhood, your innocent childhood as an adult, you realize, oh, there's lots of sketchy stuff going on, and this isn't as wonderful as I thought. And there's sort of this veneer over everything. So, yes, that is one of the stories. Another story is the other populist, which is Bernie Sanders, which is, hey, the villain is the wealthy, and we can tax them, and we can make them finally pay their fair share. And once that occurs, everything is going to kind of fall into place, and people will be equal and free. And I say that is a laudable vision, but there's the vision has its own problems, and I like the man Bernie Sanders. I will say that when people say that they like his consistency, I have to push back against that because when I see or when I hear consistency, I like that he is articulate on his points, but consistency to me over like a 30 or 40-year period for his entire career just says that he's an ideologue, which means that he doesn't accept new information and he doesn't really listen to changing realities. He is so set in how he sees things that he doesn't take on new information. So you can see it that way, or you can just say it's purely a good thing. I see it as actually a bit of a bad thing. And that leads me into the third candidate, which is the one, spoiler alert, that I particularly liked was Andrew Yang. He's no longer in the race, but his story was a more complex one, and it was that the villain isn't actually something with a face. It's not the immigrants, it's not the wealthy. There are problems associated with each of those. Our immigration system isn't great, and the wealthy get away with a lot of ridiculous stuff that they should not. But the real source of a lot of our problems is technology and the slow encroachment of automation. And that's a much more difficult thing for people to grasp, and it's really, I think, depressing for some people because it's not a simple fix. It doesn't have a face. You can't kick out automation or force automation to pay its fair share in taxes. So people tend to turn away from it. But what Bernie Sanders, for example, is missing is that he has this really Marxist view of the world where he says people are exploited, and and the wealth inequality is so insurmountable that things are going to fall apart, and one group of people is just exploiting the other. And I say, yeah, there's truth to that, right? There is exploitation and there is tremendous wealth inequality. However, it's no longer the world that we were once living in, where labor, like in the early 20th century, when we needed people to be laborers to build these things and to industrialize. And we had huge standing armies at the time because we were engaging. Well, the U.S. didn't have a standing army that was massive, I guess. But the point is that a lot of countries had massive militaries, and the need to keep those filled with soldiers, with bodies, right? So between soldiers and laborers, there was a need for people, and there was an emphasis on supplying a basic level of comfort for them when it came to food and resources, and um, you know it was not communism. The idea was to avoid communism by providing a basic level of living. But anyway, in the past, you could, as a laborer, walk off the job. You could strike if you weren't getting the wages or the treatment that you felt that you deserved. And there was power in collective action. And there was leverage because you were really badly needed. Today, it's not the same reality because the employer can then say, all right, I don't need you. I'll just put a robot, a machine with some artificial intelligence, some algorithm, and it can do your job way faster, way more efficiently. I was kind of doing a favor for you in the first place by having you have a job, but my duty as an entrepreneur or as somebody who's running a company is not to create jobs and provide jobs, but to create a marketable product. And that's ultimately the reality, is that the leverage that labor once had no longer exists. So the idea was to have, one of the ideas was a universal basic income, which could help accommodate for that, how people no longer largely, and this is going to be increasing, have an economic value. So how do you deal with that? A universal basic income is one way, but somebody like Bernie Sanders unfortunately can't actually add that onto their platform right now because it would require acknowledging that his other proposals, like $15 minimum wage and guaranteed jobs for all, are not going to work, because $15 minimum wage would increase um, uh, inflation pretty badly because it's creating value out of nothing. And the guaranteed jobs for all really only works assuming that you have jobs that need to be done, that are necessary, and that humans are the only means to do them. So otherwise, what you do is you create make work projects like bridges to nowhere, and you force people into bureaucracies, and that's what happened in the Soviet Union. It was a giant bureaucracy, and the sole job of bureaucrats is to come up with regulations. And of course, regulations need to exist, but once you have unnecessary excess regulation, it becomes impossible to do anything effectively. So government screeches to a halt. Everything screeches to a halt. If you've ever had to work to try to get something done through bureaucracy, you know what I'm talking about. And once you have regulation to that capacity, then you get lobbyists, because regulation necessitates that companies can send representatives to government, to the halls of government, to lobby on behalf of the companies and pay off politicians. So when a politician says out of one side of their mouth, we need more regulation, but out of the other side of their mouth, they say we need to get money out of politics, they are their own worst enemy, because those two sort of necessitate each other. And okay, those are the three candidates that are going to inspire people to actually vote for them. Like I said, one of them is out already, Andrew Yang. So now you're left with Donald Trump, who is incumbent, he's president, and Bernie Sanders. What I think is going to happen is that Bernie Sanders is going to win the Democratic nomination. He's the one that is inspiring a lot of people, particularly a lot of young people who want change. And I think that's going to, I mean, it already is, I know. The conversations I have with older people, it freaks them out because younger people don't view socialism in the same way. They don't have the same, okay, this has limitations view, and they see young people as simply wanting free stuff and not seeing the consequences or the costs of these pretty radical proposals. And there's truth to that, but then there's also the fact that that older people don't understand the depths of how far the system that they think they live under has actually crumbled. And and I know I keep kind of swinging around and tunneling into different things here, but it's important, and I'll get back to the politics thing in one sec. But another thing is that older people don't really understand from a, based on a lot of what I've talked with them about, how they were born into a very specific period in time. And this isn't just the older people today. This is, I think, older people throughout time, is that they haven't realized that the time in which they grew up was extremely unique and is not just like the status quo of how it's been forever. So, if you're a baby boomer, you grew up during the high, you came of age, you didn't come of age, you were born into the high post World War II, and you had the GI Bill, which really established probably a lot of parents of baby boomers. And then you had this jobs boom where there was tons of work available. From what I hear, it's like you could just immediately walk into numerous jobs if you were hungry and determined to actually work. You had jobs that were loyal to their employees and employees that were loyal to their jobs. So there was generally sort of a ladder that you would climb. There were more guaranteed benefits. There were these new programs that were established with the baby boomers particularly in mind, like Social Security, which was built on the assumption that you're always going to have a large population of people and that people were going to in perpetuity live to the age of like 70, so like 5 years of retirement, and it was going to be a simple, sustainable system. Terrible assumptions, because in reality, the support population for Social Security basically crashed. So now we have like, I don't know, 1/5 of the people of the size of the baby boom population that are actually supporting payments for baby boomers now. And you also have, instead of 5 years of retirement, like 30 years of retirement. So entirely unsustainable. Um, and then you had interest rates that were more favorable. You had college costs that were much lower. You had, and by the way, the GI Bill, like I was talking before, paid particularly for our grandparents to go through college and established them in a lot of careers. And then you had, I'm thinking of my grandfather. He worked on the highways. He was a civil engineer, so you had these big projects going on, these giant government projects. So it's like the idea of what's socialism and what isn't, and I never have benefited from socialism, and socialism shouldn't exist, and everything that I've done for myself is really a myth that was born and propagandized through the uh, the baby boom generation, and it's one that people still live with today. It's inherent to a lot of conservative thought, and I have a conservative streak myself, so I'm not just demeaning conservative thought, but that whole idea of individualism, it really is a myth in that like we all of the support structure in our life, all of the things that allow us to do what we do and to be ambitious and to accomplish what we want to accomplish become invisible because we like to give in to our ego and our narcissism and say, "Hey, I did this by myself." So all the scaffolding, all the support roles in our lives, all the institutions, everything, we just go, "No, I did this by myself, and everything that I have is mine." So we have fed that beast, and we need to figure out how to not flip over to the hardcore socialist communist side, but to be more to open to aspects of socialism and aspects of things that are kind of like socialist adjacent. We need to have a type of capitalism that really works for people rather than just for some companies and the government. And right now we have tons of people enriching themselves. We have the revolving door between Washington and private business, where, for example, somebody will work in DC at a regulatory agency and then leave DC and become a, what do you call them? A, not an advisor, but a, uh, I can't remember the term. Essentially, they become somebody who advises private companies. I'm gonna go nuts not remembering this word. All right, doesn't matter. But basically, the idea is people go from private industry to DC, and they make their money that way, and then they also go in the reverse direction. So you have this revolving door effect. We need to make sure that that no longer happens. People don't enrich themselves on the public's behalf. We also need to, so kind of reinstituting a civic mindedness, right? Which I said before is going to happen. But then we also need to keep in mind that when we say, hey, I was responsible, so the other people that weren't responsible, whether it be college debtors, well, whether it be people who have accumulated other kinds of debt, screw them, whatever. Because eventually this stuff becomes your problem. And you have to realize that part of the reason that you became successful to begin with, whether it was something you did directly or whether it was general culture wise, is American culture is economic culture, at least, and the size of our economy has been based off of making it as easy as possible for people who should not spend beyond their means to spend beyond their means. And I mean, nobody should spend beyond their means, but we make it very easy and we entice people to do that. And we basically have advertisements that our whole advertisement industry is based off of convincing people to buy and consume and consume and consume, to live beyond their means. We have cheap lines of credit. We said, hey, more people should have houses. That's the ticket to the American dream. Houses, banks make interest rates lower, subprime mortgages, housing market collapses in 2008. Then we said, hey, what your actual ticket to the American dream is college education. Everybody get a college degree. Doesn't matter what it is. College is the key. And then subsidized college. And then college is like, what, 70 grand a year now or something like that. So now you have everybody with student loan debt. And the way that I look at it is, we're all in this together. The retirement crisis, the student loan crisis, those are just two generational crises, two peas in a pod that we're going to have to figure out solutions to. And we can't kick the can down the road forever. We need to make our system more sustainable, and we need to realize that our economic engine is not sustainable. The idea that consumer culture and being wasteful and consuming endlessly is not going to work continuing on. We need to have a replacement economic engine, such as innovation. Um, Maybe the consumption is going to be um, a different kind of consumption. I personally think that it's going to move toward content consumption. I think that people are less into the idea of ownership of everything than they are into access and learning about ideas and content that they like, rather than all the time being responsible for paying off bills for 2 vacation homes, a primary residence, 4 vehicles, a boat, all these things, right? So the ownership mentality has shifted as well. Um, so I know that, oh, by the way, the term I was trying to think of before was consultant. So you get a lot of people leaving the regulatory agencies and becoming consultants in private industry. Um, so what I think is going to happen, returning to politics, is it's going to be Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump. I don't think that, aside from baby boomers who want somebody who's talking about something that they understand and somebody who's non-threatening, very many people support Joe Biden or somebody of the Joe Biden type becoming president. They're just not. He's not inspiring. He just is simply saying, "Hey, well, let's just continue to have things the way that they are, or sort of return things to the way that they were just pre-Trump." And that's not really an era that people find appealing. A lot of people don't like Trump, but a lot of people still don't want to just simply return to just what it was pre-Trump, because what things were pre-Trump are what brought about Trump. So it doesn't really make sense. Um, I was talking with my friend Connor recently. It was the last podcast episode, called second to last one, called Whistleblower Part 3. And towards the end of the episode, we were talking about the Democratic National Convention of 1968. This is going to become relevant again. Basically, this was in the midst of the Vietnam War. President Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, he had stepped out and said, "I'm no longer running for president." He became president when Kennedy got assassinated in 63, won his own term in 64. So he served 5 or 6 years as president. And now at the DNC, you have his vice president running as the incumbent, Humphrey. And then you also have another, you had Robert Kennedy running. You had, let's see, McCarthy, who, I don't know, might have been a senator. It's not Joe McCarthy, the anti-communist guy, Red Scare guy. It's not him. And then you also had McGovern. And so basically, Robert Kennedy got shot, he got assassinated, and that caused a lot of chaos. This was a violent year already. 1968 was an extremely violent year. Street protests, um, people lighting stuff on fire, people fighting, clashes between cops and protesters. And so Humphrey, the vice president of LBJ, comes in at a point in time where he has missed all the primaries and all of the voting, and he just kind of automatically gets the delegates that were going to Johnson. And so that pisses a bunch of people off, because he just like steps into the contest late, kind of like what Mike Bloomberg has been doing this time around, right? And so what happens is, even though um, McCarthy, who happened to be the anti-war candidate that was probably going to win, and then a lot of people really liked, because so many people, particularly young people, were anti-war and wanted change. Um, Even though he got the majority of the delegates through the primary, and fact check me on this, read about the Democratic National Convention of 1968. But even though that happened, Humphrey, the VP, the one who was basically going to continue along with LBJ's Vietnam War policy, he was the one that was given the nomination. That pissed a lot of people off, and it was seen as undemocratic and shady and underhanded, and that made violence a lot worse. And I think we're going to see something like that. I think that what's going to happen is Bernie Sanders is going to rightfully win because people really want change and they want somebody with a vision. And the DNC is going to say, no, we're not going to give Bernie Sanders the nomination. We're going to give it to Joe Biden or somebody like that. That is more reliable and consistent with traditional. I don't know if I say traditional. Maybe I should say consistent with more like corporate Democrat type beliefs, or maybe mainstream Democratic Party, less fringy or less radical, right? So I think you're going to end up with a lot of pushback, a lot of pissed off people. People already know that Bernie Sanders was screwed over in 2016 when Debbie Wasserman Schultz. There was an email that came out saying, "Hey, let's push the people towards Hillary, the Bernie people towards Hillary." So people already feel like Bernie's been screwed over. They're driven by that, and there's going to be violence if Bernie doesn't get the nomination and he still gets the vote. And there's already been, if you've been paying attention, some amount of blackout of the support for Bernie Sanders. Pretty significant, actually. And so people are going to be pissed off and they're going to riot and they're going to cause violence, and there's going to be basically a giant rift in the Democratic Party, and you're going to see a version of what happened with the Republicans in 2016 now happen to the Democratic Party. So you're going to see both parties be turned into something else entirely in an 8-year period. And so yeah, labels, right? What a Democrat and a Republican before 2016 versus after 2020. Ugh, it's something entirely different, but they're going to share the same labels that they had before. Um, and I think that Bernie is still going to get the nomination, and then he's going to lose to Donald Trump. And I think that Donald Trump is going to preside over an economic downturn, and I'm hoping that that downturn isn't really, really severe. But I think that once that occurs, people are going to be somewhat more disillusioned with Donald Trump's presidency. Some people will just outright never say, I don't support Donald Trump anymore. Some people, as with any candidate, once there's an emotional attachment to that person, that candidate is the avatar, and they see themselves in that candidate. So I think that's what a lot of people are seeing with Donald Trump, is this guy is me, even if I'm worse off under the administration that he presides over, then I'm not going to turn against this person who speaks for me. He speaks on my behalf. He speaks like I speak. So I think after another 4 years of Donald Trump, people are going to be very much more open to real change. And by that point, the older politicians, I think, are going to be kind of like used up. And there's going to be room for newer ideas, really new ideas, not just like older ideas that are radical, but actually new ideas and implementation of technology. And there's going to be more trust, I think, with younger people taking on roles in government and constructing a system. But that's based on how we behave over the next 4 years, what we do. Do we become cynical and just let the system burn down? Because I mean, that's kind of already been happening for 4 years now, is like we've been living through a system that's been in its final stages of collapse, right? It's like we've been the system as is has been living on borrowed time, and you're watching. It's like watching a family member go through um, kind of the end of life if they're in rapid decline, or I should say slow decline, really. And people mistake this decline. I mean, you get a lot of people who are fatalistic, let's say, who want to see this decline as total decline, as final decline, like the United States is going to cease to exist now. And that's not necessarily true, because you get cyclical decline, but then you come back from it if you have the drive and the determination to make that happen. If you commit to the attitude that this is it, we're collapsing, then that I'm a big believer in self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that if you believe that, that will happen. But we've only lived, particularly young people, at a time of plenty in general, and at a time of the United States being a superpower. Ever since the end of World War II, the U.S. has lived through its superpower phase, where it's a basically, actually, our lifetime, it's been a monopolar world where the U.S. is the sole superpower, because the Soviet Union didn't even exist during our lifetimes mostly. So we need to realize that this stuff happens cyclically, and we can't be so arrogant as to assume that it never will happen and that we're living through the end times right now. Just because we haven't seen it before in our lifetimes, things get bad from time to time. But we have to keep our eyes towards the future, and we have to basically make sure that that future comes about. And that becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is the pep talk that even though the night is darkest before the dawn, even though we're about to go through some shit with the 2020 election and its follow-up over the next 4 years, that we're going to make our way through this, and we're going to be a stronger, better version of what we are, and probably more streamlined and more modern, and not everybody is going to like exactly what we are, but it's going to be the best damn compromise that we can reach. And liberals and conservatives are going to find each other again. They're going to recognize that, hey, evil, stupid, deplorable, those were things said in the heat of the moment a couple, 4 years ago or whatever. And we actually are going to see our common humanity, and we're going to realize that the country needs progressives, liberals, conservatives, libertarians, needs all of those groups. It needs the tension between them and it to function properly. And if we have an understanding of that, that the more creative minds, the more progressive and liberal minds, and then the implementation minds, which are better at actually bringing ideas about, are what we're going to need in this dream team that we're going to have to come together and assemble for establishing this new reality in 21st century America. Is that we're going to need the dreamers, the idealists, the people that can come up with what needs to exist and what could exist, and then the people that can implement it. And the liberal progressive types are better at conceiving of a lot of that stuff, and the more conservative types are better, like I just said, of bringing it about and implementing it and coming up with the structures and the reality and the real world of it. And if you don't believe me, it's exactly what the United States is to begin with. I mean, if you look back, the original founding fathers were these liberal intellectual types, probably much like the exact liberal intellectual types that conservatives find so very annoying today. And they got together in Philadelphia in I don't know, 1777 or 1778, whatever, when they were coming up with the Constitution and the founding principles and documents of this very country. And they were right out of the Enlightenment, original classical liberals, and they had crazy new ideas and new visions, and that eventually became the basis of what conservatives today are trying to conserve, and what people eventually came to try to implement is the things that were laid down in the United States founding documents. And we're at a point today where we need both liberals and conservatives again. And today's liberals, we're having a new kind of founding period almost, where a lot of those ideas, instead of coming from a bunch of white dudes in powdered wigs in Philadelphia, are coming from a lot of young people with crazy technological ideas in Silicon Valley. That's one place, and then just a lot of people with um, creative content, podcasts, YouTube channels, whatever, that are keeping the conversations going. So it's exciting. It's a new time. It can all connect together in ways that things previously couldn't. And whole new opportunities are going to become available that previously were not possible at all. So this is going to be pretty cool. How are we going to define ourselves? What ideas are we going to bring about? And how are we going to refine what our plans are? And we're going to live in a very modular moment where everybody's coming up with an idea that can connect with another idea, and then you plug and play all those different ideas off of each other. And I know it's a buzz term, but collaboration. We're living in a time of collaboration where previously, in this last era, it was much more, the story was much more purely capitalistic and almost, I'm not sure if you know who Gordon Gekko is, but he was a character in the movie Wall Street, which came out in the 80s. It was a Oliver Stone movie. And the line "greed is good" is from that movie. And unfortunately, we kind of internalized that idea over the last, I don't know, 50, no, 40 years, where we took that spoof line and said, hey, you know what? Maybe greed is good. Maybe it's survival of the fittest. Maybe taking advantage of people is okay. And we're moving from that dominance mindset and that individualist mindset to, hey, this is my idea and I'm implementing it, and that's the end of it. I'm going to reap most of the benefits, and um, screw everybody else. I'm not saying that's how most people think, but that's how definitely some people think. We're no longer, that's no longer going to be the tolerated way of, or the celebrated way of being a creator in the United States. It's going to be being collaborative, connecting your ideas and your projects with other people's and making something better, making your idea better, making the other person's better. It's no longer a, hey, it's your way or my way. There can be only one winner. One must dominate the other. It's, hey, let's meet up. Let's find out how our ideas differ, how they're the same, and let's make something better. Let's merge them. Let's potentially leave with better versions of our own ideas, whatever. But that's going to be a new way of really looking at the whole system. And this is something that I didn't bring up before, and I know I'm running into an hour and 15 minutes now, but it's just something that's in my mind because I've been reading a bunch about it recently and seeing some documentaries and watching some movies about it. But it's the high prevalence of psychopath, sociopath, and narcissist tendencies among people in positions of power. I think that we're drawn towards people who are highly charismatic, obviously, right? Is because they tend to tell the best stories and be the most compelling. But there is a high prevalence of um, of being charismatic among those who are narcissistic, sociopathic, and psychopathic. And those people can be pretty good at hiding that they're those things. And there is a disproportionate amount of them in power positions, and they belittle and demean other people, and they walk all over them, and you end up with situations where people feel trapped, they feel small, they feel like they can't say anything, they feel like the whole system is like this, so why should I complain about it? And to some extent, they're right. We allowed the system to become that way, but that's not the default. We defaulted to just allowing, to being basically charmed by narcissistic, sociopathic, and psychopathic people who eventually became the dominant force in a lot of our endeavors, whether it's corporate, whether it's governmental. So I think realizing in the future that rewarding those characteristics and just saying, hey, well, it's the side of, it's the necessity of brilliance. I don't think that it is, and I don't think that it continues to have to be. I think that's a cop out, and that's only been that way in the past because people didn't recognize it for what it was, and because it benefited those who otherwise, um, you know, would have to call it out, I guess. So, I've recently been reading about, let's see, I read about Jeffrey Epstein, about Harvey Weinstein, about the Bikram yoga guy, about, I read I'm sorry, not the sociopath, the psychopath test by John Ronson. And these are definitely all examples of stories where something was allowed to continue to exist because people simply felt it was the dominant culture and that they couldn't do anything about it and they were afraid to speak up. And we need to create an environment where more people feel like they can engage and contribute their voice and their ideas, and also an environment that no longer rewards that kind of behavior that diminishes and demeans and makes people small and really cuts their voice out entirely. So that's really what I'm going to end on is that idea that what we're moving towards is going to be, I mean, inclusivity is such a buzzword for me, but yeah, I mean, it's supposed to be more inclusive, and it's going to be much better than the anxious hell that people feel like they're living through right now. So keep that in mind. And once again, I'm sorry for the rambling nature of what this last hour and 20 minutes sometimes was. I'll try to neaten up in the future when I have these monologue type videos, but I think that you will find a lot to digest here. And if you have any comments or questions or want to see more stuff like this, or you absolutely hated this, whatever, just let me know. And thank you for listening. Thank you.